All right, this is Ricky,
And this is Brendan.
and you're listening to A Gentleman's Disagreement.
What I wouldn't give for the hope I used to find in a case of lion's head. Folks of different minds, because even though we did not share the pains we share, that American ideal, friends made over arguments in an early morning buzz. Need an early morning buzz.
All right, Brendan, it is Tuesday, February 25th. Um, you just came back from a little trip up north. How was your time in Montreal?
Yep, did a visit to the future 51st state, which is quickly becoming one of my favorite states, Ricky. I was out in Canada, in Alberta this summer, out in Edmonton and Calgary, and I came back and I was like, man, I'm a huge Canada guy. And that seems to be, I don't know if that's popular. I can't even tell if it's popular or not popular these days. Whatever. I am a huge Canada guy. I was up in Montreal this past weekend, 2 feet of snow. So that was, but whatever. Ricky, what I always say is that I knew when I went up to Montreal in the middle of February that it was going to be cold, but I like cold places to be cold. That's like this Montreal to me, obviously, I'm sure it's beautiful in the summer. I haven't been up there in the summer in years, but I kind of wanted to go up there and experience it in the winter, and I did. I got to do a lot of historical stuff. Got to see Notre Dame, that cathedral up there was one of the most beautiful I've ever seen. Got to do some of the other kind of like old Montreal history. They have a really cool like biodome there, a wonderful Musée de Beaux Arts, and also the Four Nations tournament was up there, so got a little hockey in too. But anyway, it was a great trip. Really enjoyed it. Highly recommend Montreal, Canada in general. Great place.
Yeah, after the Four Nations, I heard some Canadians quipping that maybe the U.S. would be better served to be the 11th province or 14th province.
Ah,
But speaking about prospective colonies, what are we talking about this week?
yeah. Excited to welcome on Sam Klug, who is a history professor down at Loyola, Maryland. He just came out with a new book, really just in the last month, called The Internal Colony Race in the American Politics of Global Decolonization. It's something that caught our eye, and I think it'll be an interesting conversation. I think what we're hopeful to do is talk about the book, the thesis of the book, why Sam wanted to write it. But as always with historical works, try to tie it through to today and why what Sam's writing about in the 20th century is still very much relevant in from the words to the movements to some of the kind of like the concepts and figures, like why it's still relevant today. So that's the goal of the conversation, and we'll see how we do with that. But very excited to talk to Sam tonight.
Yeah, looking forward to it.
All right, let's bring Sam on. A little reunion, Ricky. We haven't seen Sam in a long time, but I'm very excited to see him in a minute. All right, we are now super excited to welcome Sam Klug onto the program. Sam is an assistant teaching professor of U.S. history at Loyola University of Maryland. He received a BA with a major in history from Columbia University and a master's in history and his PhD from Harvard University. He just published his first book, The Internal Colony: Race in the American Politics of Global Decolonization, which is why he's on, through the University of Chicago Press. And most importantly, he is a graduate, a high school graduate of the Roxbury Latin School, which is also where Ricky and I went to high school. So we are really excited to reconnect with Sam, particularly when he's had kind of such an exciting moment in his life and his career. So, Sam, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me on.
All right. So before we get into the book itself, Ricky and I, you were gracious enough to send us a copy of the manuscript. The book literally just came out like within the last month. And so one of the things I was thinking about was while this book seems to me to fit into kind of a greater category of United States history and post-war, like global history, it's also very much a book about kind of Black Americans and Black people kind of across the globe. we're having this conversation of two white guys and an Indian guy. We're about to talk about kind of like black issues and black history and black power. And obviously, as someone that has been doing this work for a long time, I'm sure these are issues that you've thought about. So how have you kind of thought about that as being like a white man really doing work in like a black history?
Yeah, I really appreciate the question, Brandon. So the project is at the intersection, as you said, of post-war U.S. history, African American history, the history of U.S. foreign policy and international affairs. And my kind of interest in a lot of these issues stems in part from kind of an intellectual interest in a lot of the thinkers that I write about, but also a political one. As a person kind of on the left, I've been very interested in um, the ways in which racial inequality has sort of deformed American democracy. And the ways that intersects as well with kind of the U.S. global role. Um, and approaching those questions was something that made me want to be a historian. And I think one of the things that, there's a lot of different ways to kind of get at those questions, but I think it's really important to kind of understand um, the ways that African American thinkers and writers and activists have developed their own ways of thinking about American systems of hierarchy and inequality. I think that um, a lot of the time, white scholars who are interested in these issues are really interested in the ways that sort of racial inequality gets reproduced, and they focus a lot more on sort of white actors in that process. And I think that is really important work too, and that's one I think style of approaching it. But I think it's also very important for you know white Americans and certainly white American historians to read deeply in the traditions of Black political thought to try to get an understanding of that work. And that is sort of what I'm trying to do in the book. And I try to approach that, I don't sort of make any bones about who I am, but I just try to approach that with as much kind of honesty and integrity in reading the sources rigorously, taking them extremely seriously, taking arguments within sort of Black political the thought very seriously, and try to bring that to bear in my work.
Yeah, that I appreciate the response, and like I said, I knew that you would have a thoughtful answer because you have to. I taught middle school for a long time in Boston here, and I think I always in some ways struggle because the work is so important for everyone to do, all Americans to do, kind of racial across the racial spectrum, but just being like transparent with like your students and your peers about like you're coming to this work with particular perspectives and bias, and you're just going to do the best you can with it. But even like a cursory read of your work shows like that you obviously like spent a lot of time with black sources, right? From Du Bois up to Raymond Williams, like you can just rattle them all off, and it's really kind of it seems to me like an exploration of uh, like ideas within the like of the black I don't know diaspora or educational community. Like oh, it in what I guess my question what I want to get at is the quote that you open the book with, the Raymond Williams quote, is all about like vocabulary. And so it seems to me like you are one of the maybe larger themes of the book is the importance of vocabulary and kind of naming certain concepts. In this case, like your book is called The Internal Colony, but that's maybe just an example of the larger theme of the importance of having proper names and terms for like larger ideas.
Yeah, absolutely. So I do draw this idea of a kind of political vocabulary. And the epigraph of the book, as you mentioned, is from Raymond Williams, who's not a black thinker. Actually, he was a white British intellectual who wrote a book called Keywords, a study of culture and society, which is where that book that specific quote is drawn from. But he's kind of a methodological kind of inspiration in some ways, and he was really interested in how political languages develop out of kind of social movements and out of social relationships, and then how they also kind of ramify into concepts that shape the way that people understand the world, that then have an effect on political realities. And so that's kind of like just like, and now we're a little bit, not to get too try not to get sort of too highfalutin with it, but that sort of is one of my kind of big inspirations for thinking about the different concepts that Americans use to make sense of global decolonization and how global decolonization sparked a kind of series of transformations in how Americans thought about racial and class inequality, both in what are kind of typically understood as kind of domestic contexts. And so that's really kind of what the book is driving at, is to trace the emergence of these different competing political vocabularies around exactly that question. How should global decolonization influence the way that Americans understand their place in the world and their own systems of racial and class inequality at home?
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. I mean, for me, this was probably the first time I'd ever come across this notion of the internal colony that you could understand kind of the experience of the African American in relationship to other colonies that had been previously held by like Western European countries. I wonder if you can, um, but my understanding was like very shallow and superficial in that regard. I wonder if you can help maybe sort of paint the picture of what is the central thesis of what does it really mean an internal colony?
Yeah, great question. And that is kind of core to the book. Um, so there's a longer history dating all the way back to the 19th century, um, and of African Americans understanding themselves as a nation within a nation. That line is used by Martin Delany, who's um, a black abolitionist, and that line is picked up in the early 20th century by people, all across the political spectrum. Du Bois uses it, W.E. Du Bois. Marcus Garvey uses that idea of a nation within a nation. And so that notion of, well, what defines this peoplehood that is, defined in some ways by diaspora inherently, by the condition of enslavement and then emancipation, and in the middle of the 20th century, that kind of broader idea really comes into contact with this huge global transformation, this huge process of global decolonization as anti-colonial movements across Asia and Africa are winning independence, are reimagining the world after the European empires that had so dominated the world for hundreds of years are coming to an end. And so there develops a really influential way of thinking among various Black intellectuals and also civil rights activists and ultimately Black power activists who take the concept who become in some ways the kind of the Black Power movement is where this concept takes the widest hold, who argue that there are important comparisons to be made between American forms of racism, whether it be, Jim Crow segregation, which was often seen actually as a model for colonial states abroad, or whether it be the forms of racialized economic inequality that are so pervasive in the North in the middle of the 20th century, that these are analogous to uh, forms of racialized economic inequality in the colonial system, wherein white European powers are extracting resources for their benefit from and denying sovereignty to the black and brown peoples of the rest of the world. And that becomes a really powerful way of both globalizing the African American freedom struggle, the civil rights movement, by saying not, we're not a kind of minority within this one nation, but a part of a kind of global majority. And it's also a way of kind of reframing the American story away from, certain concepts that seem to kind of celebrate a kind of narrative of American progress that some Black thinkers and activists were, increasingly uncomfortable with.
Yeah, I think that that piece of it was really interesting to me. Just the idea that America, like the United States, at that same time was really trying to fashion itself almost as like the right. I forget exactly the term, but sort of the first like non-colonial power that was juxtaposed to, say, the British Empire or one of these other places where freedom and self-determination and these types of ideas are inherent to who we are, and yet we have this, the original sin of slavery, and then following that, Reconstruction and Jim Crow segregation. I guess I wonder. Um, so from that perspective, like the idea of decolonization makes a lot of sense, but I think you point out throughout the book, or at least sort of the conclusion is that it falls out of favor because of this idea that so many of these places that did gain sovereignty were, still impoverished 10, 20, 30 years later. I wonder if you can kind of expand on that and exactly like, why uh, or why throughout history it kind of the analogy of decolonization sort of either fell apart or fell out of favor.
Absolutely. I'll start with the point you made about the kind of framing of the United States as the first new nation in the late 1950s and early 1960s. I focus on this in a chapter in the book because the book does trace a variety of different ways of kind of trying to make sense of the relationship between the United States and its history and its forms of inequality, and then this global story about decolonization. But for the sort of New Frontier era, John F. Kennedy liberals of the Democratic Party, it was a really powerful idea to say the United States is the quote unquote first new nation, meaning that at this moment in the late 50s and early 1960s, when you have all of these countries gaining their independence, especially in Africa, 17 African nations gained their independence in 1960 alone. Um, those states are both are subject to intense competition in the Cold War between U.S. and Soviet influence, and that competition sometimes takes material forms in terms of economic aid, but it also kind of takes ideological forms. And so for John F. Kennedy and people in his administration, and also a lot of sort of liberal social scientists at that time, there developed this really powerful language to say the United States obviously is not a new nation like these newly decolonized states like Ghana. Um, it's an old nation. It goes back to 1776, but it has its origins in the same kind of process of breaking free from the British Empire through the American Revolution. And that claim that the U.S. is a kind of spiritual kin with these countries in Asia and Africa became a really powerful part of the kind of Kennedy administration's um, kind of you could call it propaganda. I think more correctly you would call it their kind of ideology, and that is really sharply contested by a lot of and that is being adopted and talked about at the same time as the analysis of African Americans as an internal colony is starting to take greater hold in Black intellectual circles and in the Black freedom movement, which is a kind of direct counter concept in some ways, right? Rather than the US as the exemplar of decolonization, the notion of the US as holding within itself an internal colony was a powerful argument kind of against that national self-image. Um, and, I think the spur of global decolonization itself, right, was a major reason why both of those concepts became so important when they did, right, in that early 1960s moment. And I traced, throughout the latter half of the book, many of the kind of very in the weeds arguments about what it means to be an internal colony, whether that's an appropriate analogy, and how different figures in the civil rights and Black Power movements approach that question. And as you note, right, the book kind of closes with the sort of denouement of the concept's significance in, I think, kind of movement politics, let's say, by the middle of the 1970s. The concept of internal colonialism actually takes off in the academy in the 1970s, and you have all of these kind of different versions of it in sociology, talking about, the Welsh and the Irish and different other communities, within the United Kingdom and stuff. But as a kind of powerful language of a social movement, it really is starting to decline by the middle of the 1970s. And I think there's a few different reasons for that. One of them is that the experience of decolonization in the nations of Asia and Africa has by the 1970s been marred by the rise of authoritarianism in some of these states, by civil wars, a particularly important um, example of an event that I don't cover, but has a big impact in the African American community is the Nigeria Biafra Civil War. Brenda Gale Plummer is a scholar who's written a lot about this, and that sort of breaks apart in some ways certain kind of African American alliances abroad, and as you mentioned, the continuation of forms of kind of economic colonialism without formal colonialism is another kind of problem that a lot of these thinkers are wrestling with. So that is one part of the story, I think, of the concept sort of um, diminution of its importance by that period of time. Another part of that is the sort of increasing power of the new right in the United States by the late 1970s, and their foreign policy concerns really kind of push the decolonizing world much to the side in the way that Kennedy and Johnson had been really concerned with how these countries understood America, were very concerned with winning their allegiance. When Jeane Kirkpatrick is sort of at the UN in the Reagan administration, that's no longer really top of mind. She could really kind of care less, um, and and I think that's an important piece, the kind of the shift away from a focus on the decolonizing world in kind of American foreign policy circles in some ways. And another, I think, actually, has to do with the fragmentation of the Black freedom movement itself. By the mid 70s, the splits between cultural nationalists and sort of more economically focused Black nationalists and the Black Power movement have grown quite severe. And so part of the agenda of figures that I write about in the late 1960s, figures like James Boggs, who's this auto worker turned, Black Power activist and intellectual. Part of his rationale for using the terminology of the kind of internal colony was to, provide a concept for understanding forms of racialized economic exploitation, all across the country that could then be kind of fruitfully addressed in a kind of national way. And by the middle of the 1970s, I think that dream for a lot of people, or the organizational capacity to kind of bring that about. And obviously we know it never was brought about, but that seems much further off at that time.
As you're talking, particularly about the 60s, I'm thinking how Kennedy and Johnson, purport to be so concerned and are so concerned about like American ideology amongst these new nations in the global South, and yet at the same time are engaging in this war in Vietnam, which is really
Absolutely.
against kind of these same people that they claim to be so concerned about their image. But also thinking about here in the United States, figures like both Martin Luther King to Muhammad Ali are kind of invoking kinship with like a spiritual oneness with the Viet Cong in some ways, to use a term of the time, and like the in Black Americans here in the United States. And
Mhm.
it's such an interesting economy, which I mean, I guess is kind of maybe the history and story of the United States writ large, but also got me thinking for all of the reasons that you said, and probably so many more. This kinship has seemed to wane globally over these last few decades. But do you see it having a little bit of a comeback now? Because as I'm starting to think, when the the Israel-Hamas war has been going on. When it first broke out, we had a professor over in Ireland come on, and he was talking about how closely Irish people felt with the Palestinian cause. And we certainly saw that here in the United States, where a lot of Black and Brown communities, like both of you guys are Columbia graduates, right? Like Columbia was one of the main campuses from that showed this, where it seemed to be like a real dividing line, where a lot of racial minorities here in the United States sympathize, empathize with the Palestinian people, despite how horrific the Hamas attack was. So I'm just kind of throwing this at you. Is there a chance we're starting to see a little bit more of that global kinship? Did it always exist, and where this incident has just brought it back up? Do you have any thoughts on that?
I think we are. I think you know, in some ways it never fully went away. My book ends really by the mid 1970s, but you could certainly, trace arenas of kind of global concern in the African American community through the anti-apartheid movement, which was so prominent going through the 1980s. You could trace the emergence, I think, of a broader set of kind of Black American sympathies for Palestine through from the 1960s right through the 1980s. Jesse Jackson was a kind of key figure in the 1980s in bringing the Palestinian cause into the American political mainstream, if you can call him mainstream, and was roundly rejected by many people for doing that. But I do think we're seeing over the past decade or so a growth in interest in making these connections again or making these connections anew between sort of residues of colonialism elsewhere and sort of exploited communities within the United States. And I think, I think you can trace that recent emergence. A lot of it, I think, has to do with um, I mean, in the United States, at least, I think, which is kind of where I know the place I know best. A lot of that has to do with the Black Lives Matter movement. 2014 and 2015, there's a tremendous amount of interchange actually between Palestinian um Palestinians and Palestinian activists in Palestine, which had, Gaza had suffered a significant bombardment in 2014. People may remember, and people were sending tips to people in Ferguson, saying, "Here's how to deal with tear gas because we have to deal with it all the time." And those connections started to be formed, I think, in that moment, and were I think. Reignited with the kind of post George Floyd uprising in the U.S., which drew so much global sympathy all around the world, including in Palestine. And I think the some of the activism for Palestine in those communities within the U.S. since 2023 has emerged out of that past decade of work. I've written some. I don't really write about Palestine much in the book, Israel Palestine in the book, but I have written some shorter articles about the kind of longer history of African American engagement with that conflict and the rise of kind of Black solidarity for Palestine in the U.S. But I do think we're at a moment where some of the history that I tell in the book of trying to have a political vocabulary that connects domestic inequalities with foreign ones is, not in the same language, of course, but is happening again in some ways.
That's really interesting. I get sort of two disparate questions on this, so feel free. I'll pose them both. Take either one. So the first is, Ricky and I were talking about this before you got on in terms of like what's the point of the of internal colony, and what I was saying to Ricky, I was like, oh, Sam should put this in the back of his book, is that it's not only trying to provide an explanation of this concept and this vocabulary for a specific period of time in United States and global history from the 40s to the 70s, but also kind of explaining why these concepts and these terms might still be relevant today, right? Because part of it is as a historian, yeah, it's important to provide more context and to a specific time period, which I think your book clearly strives to do. But also, all I would venture to say that most, if not all, historians are also trying to think like, so what does that mean for us today? So I, I'll stick with that one first. Of if we're maybe starting to see the movement rise again or be reignited by certain events, both domestically and globally, are there things that we can take or learn from these movements of the decolonization movements, the internal colony movements, like that, those movements in the language from the 40s to the 70s?
Absolutely. I think. I mean, I think I'm a historian who is unashamed about caring about the present and having that inform my work. I think some historians are a little bit sensitive around that question, and I think we live in the present. If history has any purpose at all, it's only for what it can show us in the present, not always in a very direct way, but in indirect ways. And in this case, I don't think there is like a one-to-one lesson you can take from my book for kind of how to understand some of these issues today. But I do think there are things that you can take from it that can be helpful in kind of wading through contemporary conversation. And so one thing I'll mention is like especially since October 7th and the Hamas attack and the Israeli war, you've had a lot of concern in sort of mainstream US media. You see pieces about this all the time in like The Atlantic, where people are like, what's this thing called settler colonialism? This seems like a scary new idea that a bunch of academics just came up with. And now they're kind of teaching it to all these college students, and these college students, have these weird ideas, and then they're going to the street and protesting Israel. Like I'm not doing that's not a generous reading of these articles, but that's basically what they say in various ways. And there's lots and lots of them. You can find them very easily in various publications. And one thing that I think my book should tell people is like Americans have been debating how they relate to the global history of colonialism for a long time. And they haven't always been doing it in exactly the way that people are doing it now. And maybe we have some problems with certain, slogans or whatever today. But like the idea that this is just came out of nowhere and that like Americans never have cared about what colonialism means, my book proves completely is not true. And that for again, for this long tradition in Black political thought, the definition of what a colony was a live and important question for decades. The question of what defined colonialism was a live and important question for John F. Kennedy, for diplomats in the State Department during World War II. And so we shouldn't be surprised that the question of what defines a colony is a question that people care about, and it has a much longer history. So that I think is one, I suppose, lesson to take and to kind of weed through. I think um, some of I think some of the, what what I find to be some of the more annoying elements in the kind of contemporary discourse around that.
I think that is a very astute and also just interesting point that I don't know necessarily that you're dancing around, but maybe wonder if you can elaborate on this a little bit more. Is just kind of the general association between kind of colonialism and imperialism and sort of the morality around that when we, especially here in the United States, right? Technically the former British colony that broke away and liberated itself. How do I guess how does that language relate to like what is good and what is right, what we should be fighting for and fighting against? Or does it? Yeah, maybe that was a bit of a loaded question.
It's a good and important question. I think there's a moral and an analytic part to the category that are important, and they're inseparable on some level, but it's also important, I think, and useful to think about them as two distinct parts of a concept, right? So before decolonization, there was no sort of negative stigma around the idea of colonial. I mean, there were for people who were opposed to colonialism, of course, but like the straightforward descriptions of certain political projects as being colonial are, fill the records of, the 18th and 17th and 19th and early 20th century. I mean, again, I don't want to make this a conversation about Israel-Palestine, but that is also straightforwardly fills a lot of some of the early the sort of early writings of the Zionist movement, as like this is a colonial attempt to settle this new land, and for this people, and that should be good, and that's something we embrace. And that normative delegitimation of colonialism is a product of mid-century decolonization. It's a product of the coming into independence of many of these nations, across the global South, and their declaration. I mean, they passed a declaration in on the floor of the United Nations in 1960, Declaration on the Granting of Independence to, colonial countries and peoples, or something like that, that condemned colonialism in all its manifestations, and that was a striking moment in kind of the changing understanding of the changing kind of morality, or the changing kind of global norm around the morality of colonialism. So I think that's important to just keep in mind, that like, our moral concepts have a history, and we can choose to ignore that history, but I don't know that we should. And I also think the analytic question matters too, which is like, well, what defines colonialism? And various different, scholars have debated this, activists debate this. The kind of settler colonial question is one that has been in focus a lot of late, which is a particular brand of kind of colonialism of settling a population in a new place. The U.S. is this complicated example of a settler colonial state. That was the sort of American history, but also this, breakaway state that declared its independence from the British Empire. So thinking about that analytically, and thinking what are the elements that are kind of necessary to the application of this concept, that's also something that I think is kind of important to do. And it's something that you can't kind of separate from the moral question, but it's also something that you need to bring a different set of tools to bring a sense of, okay, what's my kind of analysis of this situation? And so, I don't know if that totally answered your question, but I think that distinction is important to think with, as as especially as kind of temperatures rise around a particular question of definition, right? And that's going to happen. But yeah, I think that's um, important to keep to have a sense of, the kind of moral valence of a concept, and also a sense of what it's actually defining and carrying through.
All right, here's the second of my disparate questions, because on the one hand, I'm saying that I'm seeing in some of these movements like a global connection reminiscent of the period that you're talking about, the post-war decolonization period, and kind of seeing a rejuvenation of some of these terms and kinships across the world. And yet at the same time, I'm seeing a world that after decades of decolonization, while we don't exactly have, wouldn't necessarily call it like colonization now, you could certainly point to some imperialistic uh, tendencies from regimes across the globe, right? And so that's kind of the other part of it to me, where, and even as I was going through the book, Sam, I'm thinking you're talking so much about vocabulary and the importance of it. That was one of my first questions to you. And there's a fight about vocabulary right now, but it's kind of swinging the other way, it seems like. There's a lot of like redefining of terms that had maybe for a long time swung one way and now swinging the other. So while the first part of my question was like, oh, your book almost seems like a happy coincidence that it's timed to the resurgence of these ideas. It also seems like you are swimming against the current in publishing a book like this with these sorts of issues and these sorts of conversations about vocabulary in this current climate. So again, I'm sure you've thought about that, where some of these ideas that maybe you're proposing are not only not in vogue, but seem quite unwelcome.
Um, well, we do seem to be in a moment where territorial expansionism is back on the global menu in a way that it wasn't for some time. And um, one of my the someone I really respect is the writer and documentary filmmaker Astra Taylor, who's also a kind of activist and organizer. And she has this book called Democracy May Not Exist, but We'll Miss It When It's Gone. And I think in some ways, the liberal international order may not exist, but we'll miss it when it's gone. Like that's sort of where I tend to land regarding specifically, Putin's war in Ukraine, this Trump saber rattling around the Panama Canal and Canada and these other kinds of absurd, seemingly absurd, but also potentially quite real um, threats. And so my book again is not like about any of those things directly, but I think it speaks to, if anything, I mean, I do think it speaks to the need to not think that we have fully left behind a world in which thinking about colonialism and thinking with a lot of kind of anti-colonial activists from the middle of the 20th century is a useful thing to do.
I want to try and bring it back to the domestic context a little bit in insofar as this kind of idea that did take hold and really people were able to kind of understand the Black experience in the early part of the 20th century as one of a group of people go experiencing decolonization, to then as you sort of have talked about at length here, just that term sort of falling out of favor. I wonder if, what does revisiting the term now mean from a prescriptive sense? Like, obviously, we continue to see sort of rampant levels of inequality that often fall along racial lines. I guess I'm trying to understand, like, are there sort of lessons from decolonization that can be applied to the American context, or are there examples of where it was done well, where sort of like applying those lessons here in terms of restructuring or rethinking about society in terms of how it needs to move forward, that you see like parallels?
Absolutely. I'll give you two examples. And they're both historical, but I think they speak to very urgent contemporary crises. So one of the most common modes of making the link between, American racism and global imperialism in the 1960s in particular was an analysis of police violence. And this is particularly central in the Black Panther Party's um, political thought in their pamphlets, in their newspaper. There would constantly be these parallels drawn between, the police officer in Oakland or in Harlem and the American troop on the ground in Vietnam, right? And that these were in some ways two sides of the same coin of kind of racialized violence being committed abroad by the state and being committed at home by the state. And another phase of the kind, or another kind of key element of the kind of internal colony discourse in that mid-century moment had to do with economics, right? To say, we are kind of territorially confined by residential segregation in, racially segregated areas of concentrated poverty, right? These ghettos, to use the language of the time, are akin to colonies in the sense that we can't leave. We are sort of economically exploited by, outside landowners and businesses that are extracting from us our capital, our labor, in a way that is akin to the way that colonial rulers extract natural resources, from their colonies. And, you know, leaving aside the language of colonialism itself and whether that sort of deserves to make a comeback, I think you can still see a lot of connections between the militarization of police on American streets and the kind of reach of the American military abroad. There's a lot of people have written about this and indicated this, how much that sort of process of violence abroad kind of swings back home through police violence. And I also think that economic relations of indebtedness are a way you can make some of these links too. Like when the city of Detroit, because of the kind of municipal bonds and the debt crisis in that city, is no longer able to make decisions about how their budget is going to be run, and it's now sort of devolved to an outside, unelected body to make those decisions, often sort of at the cost of public services for the people of Detroit. That looks a lot like what happens in Puerto Rico. That looks a lot like the pressure that the IMF places on countries like Zambia, that are, at risk of default on their kind of global debts. And those are all sort of legacies of, in various ways, the kind of racialized regime of economic inequality, if you like.
Yeah, I think those examples are very powerful ones to sort of really build home sort of or take home the parallel between the two situations. I wonder if I could push you to take it a step further and expound upon like what that means for like a how do we make this situation better at the end of the day? And is it, we just need to sort of give back the resources that were extracted from these places? Or yeah, I don't have an answer, but I'm curious if you research.
Now you're asking questions that are really making historians uncomfortable. What does the past have to say to the present
Well,
is
like,
one
I
thing.
mean,
What
I
what
guess
should we
like
do is a whole other one.
yeah, yeah, but
Um,
even trying to keep it to the historical context, like was there a place, in your research that you found where sort of the experience of decolonization resulted in kind of all of the things that were promised by it?
right, right. Wonderful question. And I don't know that I have a kind of a perfect or a kind of direct answer. I do think that one of the moments of sort of like lost promise that I do think about a lot is this moment in the early 1970s, when a lot of the newly decolonized states in Asia and Africa banded together and called for a new international economic order. And this was again a resolution in the UN General Assembly. Um, it emerged from a kind of longer history of debates by, economists and lawyers and all, these statesmen, all across the global South. But it basically called for a change in some of the terms of trade between the global North and the global South, to help newly independent states kind of industrialize more quickly and not be sort of locked into their roles as, primary producers of primary goods in the global economy. It had a lot to say about the regulation of multinational corporations. It had, calls for, again, sort of debt relief, that, had, started to plague these countries immediately after they gained their independence. I mean, imposing debts on former colonies is sort of one of the oldest tricks in the book, for former colonial powers. It happened to Haiti, when Haiti won its independence, almost 200 years before all of this history I'm talking about. Um, and so I think that was a moment when you really could have seen some of the kind of economic relationships that continued in an unequal way after decolonization to be reconfigured and to change. And that project kind of failed for several reasons. I don't get into them too deeply in the book, but one was it was strongly opposed by the nations in the global north, not least the United States, and it was also came at a really inopportune time because of the oil crisis that happened in the 1970s that really drove a wedge between the oil producing nations and everybody else in the global south and made that alliance kind of harder to sustain. But I do look to some of the proposals in that group as still having a lot of value that we could look to today, kind of at the global level of changing some of these legacies of colonialism.
Yeah, you've been super generous with your time, Sam. One note from your book, or one kind of portrait, I guess you want to call it, or incident you point to, is in 2014, President Obama hosted this, like, the first gathering of Mandela Washington scholars, and you point to like a young African scholar who asked, and President Obama comes to it and fields questions from the audience, and one African scholar kind of asks him about this indebtedness that so many of, I think he says, like, our countries owe to, like, your countries, and how does President Obama, like, maybe what's his prescription? Maybe he's asking a similar question to Ricky just asked you, like, what's the prescription for that? What are we supposed to do about that? Because we're barely able to sustain our governments because we're so in debt to all of, these the global north. And Obama, you right, kind of like shrugs off the question as, oh, like, oh, back in my day, a lot of those ideas were in vogue, but in some ways we're moved past it. I thought it was a really interesting example just because it's, and I don't know, it's hard to say whether it's just for the wealthy in the United States or just for a certain segment of Americans, but it feels so easy, whether it's with these international issues or with these domestic issues, just to be like, these are things of the past. And that incident, or kind of that note, to me was very much like, yes, yes, but they're still very much impacting what's happening today. So I don't even have a question to it. I just felt like that was an impactful antidote. That was the word I was looking for. It was an antidote in the story that I felt was kind of, I'll be thinking about for a little bit.
Well, I'm glad that stuck with you. Yeah, it's a funny moment, especially right. Of course, Obama, um, not just the first black president, but um, with Kenyan father, like has so many was looked to by so many around the world as this kind of beacon of American promise. And that answer is a really interesting moment, I think, of of at least for that one young scholar, maybe some of the shine coming off that time. And it's an interesting one for me too, because I think, I wrote that epilogue sort of towards the end of the writing process, as you might imagine, but it struck me that that event that actually I was recounting took place like right before I started working on what would become the dissertation that would become the book. So that was kind of a funny thing to think about how much the last 10 years has made our country look different as well from when that happened.
Yeah, well, thank you, Sam, for your perspective. I feel like, Ricky, as I've been listening to this conversation, there's been so many questions, but I'm like, I just want to go back to, like, re-listen to it now. I feel like there's maybe things I missed, or yeah, this was just really interesting intellectually, Sam.
It was
We thought that it
wonderful
would be.
questions from both of you. I really enjoyed talking to you both.
We really, the pleasure is all ours. If people are interested in the book, where could they go get it?
Absolutely. So the book again is called The Internal Colony: Race and the American Politics of Global Decolonization. You can order it from the University of Chicago Press website. You can order it from Amazon. You can find it in bookstores, or if you go to your local bookstore and they don't have it, go right up to the desk and say, "Hey, I want you to carry this book." That nothing would make me happier. So yeah,
No, we love it. Well, again, huge congratulations to you on the book, and thank you so much for joining us. We wish you, like, huge success. And now this is one of those things now that's like on my radar. I feel like I'll be seeing it in all these different places going forward. I'm excited to see all that. Yeah.
thank you guys again so much for having me on. This was a total blast. And really appreciate the work you guys do with the podcast. It's awesome.
Yeah, as far as we've come from like the Model UN days 20 years ago, like we in some ways this is just like an elevated version of what we did 20 years
Yeah,
ago.
some ways have we come that far at all?
Yeah. Exactly. Exactly.
Thanks.
All right, Sam, thanks so much.
Well, Brendan, it's like they say, right? The more things change, the more they stay the same. I think we were joking that felt a little bit like an extension of our conversations that we had during our Model UN days at Roxbury Latin. It's Sam was, as you can tell, a very articulate and uh, active participant in Model UN, and I don't know. It obviously I think the amount of research and lived experience and other things um, you take it a step further, but it does feel like we're harkening back.
Yeah, for sure. No, that was a lot of fun. And I mean, like you say, he was so smart 20 years ago, and now he's in 20 years of learning since then. Yeah, I definitely want to go and listen back because I just feel like he gave me so much to think about. And while I'm not sure I totally agree with all of his theses or even kind of the conclusions that he was drawing from some of his theses, it was fun for me seeing your face light up to some of his answers. Like it was like you're like, oh yes, like retweet, but yeah, it's always important to engage with ideas that are different. You and I were talking about that on it's kind of a separate conversation before we even started this episode. And when we say we have like experts on the field, Sam is like truly an expert. He got his PhD in this exact like time frame and field and is now taking his thesis and turned it into like a full scale 280 page book about this exact topic. So he is truly an expert. Ricky, I guess the one thing that stood out to me was just this continuing connection between like the global and the domestic. And you mentioned the term like original sin, right? Whether it's slavery here in the United States or the colonization by Western European nations, and just a continuing conundrum for people today to try to figure out how do you deal with history like that? Like what is the answer? Like can you? And that's why I mentioned that Obama anecdote at the end where it stuck with me because for a lot of people, and I don't mean this as a criticism of Obama. He was obviously in this really difficult place where if he was too black or too African, he would get crucified. And then if he became across as well, he's not leaning into his black roots enough. He was in a no-win situation with that. But I think it was emblematic, that incident that Sam recounted in his book of let's try to put some of this stuff behind us, right? Let's just go forward and we'll just kind of move forward from here, whether it's domestically or globally. And that's nice in theory, but the unfortunate reality is that like we can't really move on. And it also, Sam mentioned Haiti at the end. It made like thought about our conversation with Brian Kincannon last June about Haiti, where it's like you look at Haiti and you're kind of like, why is it such a mess? Like, why can't they figure it out? And then Brian's like, I'll tell you exactly why they can't figure it out because of all like hundreds of years of whether it was colonial rule or by this interference from foreign nations. And they're hard questions, Ricky. They're not easy or comfortable to wrestle with, and but this is where you have to do the hard work. Whether it's just I think as regular people that like care about these issues or care about our country and the world and like how it's created and the systems in it, and especially you hope that people in power are doing some of this thinking, although it seems to be lacking a little bit on the global stage today. But whatever, I just the questions, as uncomfortable as they are and make me, are important.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think kind of underpinning your honing in on the Obama example is the what I'm sure you would love to point out is the hypocrisy on the left of like both acknowledging these situations, but then never bringing to the fore like what it would genuinely mean to tackle them. And the history of colonialism is a history of exploitation. And so, and this is something I feel like I've been thinking about more recently because, like, yeah, what does it mean to to undo some of the things that like foundationally set the world on the path that it's on, and this like divergence between the haves and the have-nots. It's certainly tough and uncomfortable, but I don't know if it's genuinely as complex as we make it seem, or there's like a what it would take is for us to not be as rich as we are in order for others to not be as poor as they are. And that is a weird thing to think about. And I'm not suggesting that that's necessarily the only solution, but grappling with the historical sort of origins of the present day, like really does make you feel like, well, shoot. Like I do think I know the answer. I just don't think I like it.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it is I mean beyond just kind of the implications of the work that he's put in here, and I think to be quite honest, obviously it is incredibly thorough and well researched. Is definitely academic. So like the text is dense. Um, but it's I think for people who are trying to understand like how do these things kind of connect from both eras and also across geographies, I think it does like
Yeah.
a really interesting job of what like we love to do is like making those through lines. Um, and yeah, just thinking about both like how do people relate to these issues? Like we sort of generally understand the projects of colonization and then the subsequent decolonization and liberation and independence movements because they're so intertwined in our own history. But also, yeah, what does that truly mean for undoing them? And I was trying to press Sam on like, so what's the answer?
Yeah.
He's kind of saying he doesn't know.
It's
And I
also
think,
not really his job, right?
yeah, 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 fair.
Right.
Historians are, yeah,
Yeah.
I think by design not intending to make those kind of policy prescriptions, but they do provide this beautiful service in being able to
Yeah.
say like this is what has been done in the past and this is how it's turned out. And I think the reality with colonial projects, especially ones that ended in independence for, the countries that were colonized, has been sort of a wake of devastation. Although, they brought a lot of things. I know my parents, when we talk about India all the time, like the architectural legacy of the British Raj there, unfortunately, it's like fallen into decay and disrepair, but it is a wonderful one. All of India's like most famous architectural landmarks go back to even like earlier colonization by the Mughal Empire, and it's all like, Muslim architecture. And so it is like in this moment where you've got the political right here in the US, but really globally, trying to say, we need to forget about all these things that happened in the past. Those are in the past, while also knowing that there is that the past is what makes the present. Like you can't escape it in some ways. And yeah, just trying to grapple with those two things. I really enjoyed this conversation with Sam. Obviously, um, I think you can sense his lefty leanings, and he may have admitted them as well. And so I naturally am drawn to them. But beyond that, I just thought it was a fascinating conversation. And as always, very very much enjoy uh, this podcast brings them on because I don't know that we'd have them otherwise.
Yeah, because like you said, they're not often super fun and comfortable conversation to have, but whatever. It'll leave me thinking, and huge credit to Sam for doing that. Like you said, if you want to support him, you can go get his book anywhere. Like it just came out last month. It's his first book, so I'm sure any support that he gets would be appreciated. Huge thanks to Sam. Thanks to everyone that listens. Thanks to you, Ricky.
And to you, Brendan. With that, I think we can leave it there. Till next time, buddy.
I'll see you.
What I wouldn't give for hope I used to find in a case of lion's head. Folks of different minds, because even though we did not share the pains we share, that American ideal, friends made over arguments in an early morning buzz. Need an early morning buzz.